Hello class, in today's lesson we are going to talk about animal classification. We've been studying the different types of animals in class, and now we will look at the different types of classifications that you can group animals into. There are 6 different types of classifications. In each segment of this movie, we will talk about each of the 6 different classifications. The first type of animal classification that we are going to talk about today would be reptiles. There are 4 different characteristics an animal must have to be considered a reptile. The first characteristic that an animal must have would be it has to have scales. If an animal has fur, it is not considered a reptile. It must have scales. The second characteristic that an animal must have to be considered a reptile would be that it has to have dry skin. If you were to feel an animal's skin and the skin is very soft and smooth, it is not considered a reptile. The reptile must have dry skin. The next characteristic of a reptile would be that they usually lay eggs, and sometimes they even lay live young. An example of a reptile that does lay live young would be lizard. The last characteristic that an animal needs to have in order to be considered a reptile would be that the animal has to be cold-blooded. Remember that an animal must have all 4 characteristics to be considered a reptile. If the animal only has one of these characteristics, it is not considered a reptile. So remember, the 4 characteristics that an animal needs to be considered a reptile are: the animal must have scales, the animal must have dry skin, the animal must lay eggs, sometimes they can even lay live young, and the animal must be cold-blooded. The next type of animal classification would be that an animal can be classified as a bird. However, in order to be classified as a bird, there are 3 characteristics that an animal must have. The first characteristic that an animal must have to be classified as a bird would be that the animal must have feathers and wings, like the picture that you see on the screen right now. The next characteristic that an animal must have to be considered a bird would be that the animal must lay eggs. Unlike reptiles, who could lay live young, birds do not lay live young. They lay eggs. The last characteristic that an animal must have would be that it must be warm-blooded. The animal must have feathers and wings. The animal must be able to lay eggs, and the animal must be warm-blooded. It has to have all 3 of those characteristics in order to be considered a bird. The third group of animal classification would be that an animal can be classified as a fish. There are 4 characteristics that an animal must have in order to be classified as a fish. The first characteristic that an animal must have would be that it has to have scales and fins. The second characteristic that an animal must have to be considered a fish would be the animal has to lay eggs. A fish cannot lay live eggs. It lays eggs sort of like a bird does. So in order to be a fish, the animal has to be able to lay eggs. The third characteristic of a fish would be that fish are cold-blooded animals. The last characteristic that an animal must have to be considered a fish would be that it must have the ability to breathe underwater using its gills. The picture on your screen that you are seeing is an example of a fish. It is called a clownfish. That fish has all 4 characteristics that you need to be considered a fish. Let's review those characteristics one more time. The 4 characteristics that an animal needs to have in order to be considered a fish would be that it needs to breathe underwater using gills, have scales and fins, cold-blooded, and it must be able to lay eggs. The 4th classification of animals would be amphibians. There are 5 characteristics that an animal must have in order to be considered an amphibian. The first characteristic that an animal must have would be that it has to be able to live on land and in water. The second characteristic of an amphibian would be that they have webbed feet. The third characteristic that an animal must have to be considered an amphibian would be that they must have moist skin. The 4th characteristic that an amphibian has would be that they can lay eggs. The last characteristic of an amphibian would be that they are cold-blooded animals.
I've got a wet, smooth, slimy skin. Oh my gosh, I'm an amphibian.
An example of an amphibian would be the picture that is on your screen. This is a picture of a frog. And a frog has the ability to live on land and in water. They have webbed feet. They have very moist skin. They can lay eggs, and they are cold-blooded. All 5 of these characteristics are how we identify amphibians. The 5th classification group that an animal can be classified as would be insects. There are 2 characteristics an animal must have in order to be considered an insect. The first characteristic would be that the animal has to have 6 legs when they are fully grown. And the last characteristic would be that they have no lungs, but instead of lungs, they do have small openings on their bodies that they use to breathe. There is a picture of a ladybug on your screen. A ladybug falls into this classification because they have 6 legs when they are fully grown, and they have no lungs, but they do have small openings on their bodies that they use to breathe. The last group that an animal can be classified as would be mammals. There are 4 characteristics that an animal must have in order to be classified as a mammal. The first characteristic that an animal must have in order to be classified as a mammal would be that they must be able to give birth to live young. Humans are mammals because they can give birth to live young. The second characteristic that an animal must have in order to be classified as a mammal would be that they must have hair or fur. A lion has hair, so it is classified as a mammal. Another animal that is classified as a mammal would be a human because they have hair on their bodies. And then we go on to the third characteristic. The characteristic 3 for a mammal would be that they must be warm-blooded. A dog and a human are both mammals because they are both warm-blooded. The last characteristic that an animal must have in order to be classified as a mammal would be that it must be able to nurse their young with milk. A cow is a mammal because it nurses its young with milk. Humans are also mammals because they nurse their young with milk. So now let's review what we have learned about animal classification and how animals are classified as mammals. The first thing that we learned are mammals have 4 characteristics, and that first characteristic is that they must be able to give birth to their live young, such as humans. The second characteristic that an animal must have to be classified as a mammal would be that they must have hair or fur, such as a lion. The third characteristic would be that they must be warm-blooded, such as a dog or a human. And the last characteristic that an animal must have in order to be classified as a mammal would be that they must be able to nurse their young with milk, such as a human or a cow.